everybody, and welcome to Todd's Inheritance Historic Site. As you may know, we're a nonprofit foundation. We lease the site and the grounds around it in the state of Maryland. It's part of North Point State Park. And so as a nonprofit, we are dependent upon grants and donations. If any of you feel so inclined to make a donation, there's a jar outside. We do get grants. The Shine grant from the Maryland Humanities Council has made it possible for us not to have to charge admission as we used to have to do. So keep that in mind. As you probably all know, we're coming up upon in 2026 the 250th anniversary of
the Declaration
of Independence. Yeah. So even though Todd's relates a little bit more towards the War of 1812, when the British burned the house that was here, Todd's is going to shift focus a little bit to Revolutionary War topics, starting today, and we hope to have a few more sessions next year. Our speaker today is a research historian at the State Archives, Owen Lourie. He has a BA degree from Kenyon College and a master's degree from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and he's the chief historian at the Maryland State Archives. For some years now, he and others have been working to identify every common soldier that served in the Maryland troops that fought at the Battle of Long Island, and a lot of them stuck it out through the entire 8-year war. He has a book coming out sometime between now and next year on the Marylanders at the Battle of Long Island. The Marylanders, and there were some Delawareans with them, managed to save Washington's army from certain destruction a mere month and a half after the Declaration had been declared. Had they not done that, our War of Independence may have died of warning, but he served a very critical role in doing that. He's going to come back next year. We hope to have a book launch and talk about that. But today he's going to talk about another battle that occurred in the South in 1780, where Maryland troops and Delaware troops and other troops were badly used by the British, also badly used by their commanding general. Camden in South Carolina, 1780. A lot of people don't know that the British opened a second front in the South in 1780. He's going to talk about the battle, but more specifically, recently, the skeletons of how many?
14.
14 soldiers' graves were found. And they were excavated. At least one or two were British soldiers and were buried fairly decently. The others were Americans, and they were just kind of thrown under the topsoil. But forensic science has been able to tell us an awful lot about these men. So this is what you're going to hear about this afternoon, and let's welcome Owen Lourie.
Thank you, Ross, for that introduction, for the invitation to be here, and all the other staff here, so to Linda, to Jenny, to Fran. This is my first time being here, and it's had such a great welcome from everybody. I'm glad you brought up the topic of the Revolutionary War. I felt a little bit like I was on enemy territory coming up here. It's a very War of 1812 focused here. But at least when we're talking about what happens, there is the semblance of an American victory. And when I talk about the Maryland line, so much of what happens is that they lose. They spend most of the time there in the South losing, though never quite being defeated, which is why they ultimately win the war. We'll get to that in a little bit. So the Battle of Camden, August of 1780, it is a colossal defeat for the Americans. Most of the army who is down there, they're from Maryland, and the Maryland line is shattered, but as I say, not destroyed, which is important because the group that is left, and when they put themselves back together, that's the army that ultimately brings victory to the Americans in the Revolution. Some of these guys had in fact been in the Army since 1776. We'll talk a little bit about the Battle of Brooklyn in a moment. A lot of them hadn't been. A lot of them got out at the end of 79. They'd been in the Army for four plus years at that point, and most of them thought that was enough. But everyone who we're going to talk about, even the newcomers in the Army, they had learned from the older veterans that the Army that we see in 1780 is essentially all of the experience that that the Maryland line has developed over the previous 4 years. So that's why we see such a strong Army. The commissioned officers and the non-commissioned officers, many of them served from the start to finish of the war. So I visited Camden as Ross was talking about, in the spring of 2023. They exhumed 14 bodies that were there. One was a British Highlander, one was a member of the North Carolina Loyalist Militia Unit, who's probably Native American, and the rest were all from either Maryland or Delaware, probably. You can't really distinguish between that at that point. There's not enough of what's left. They were able to do some really amazing work based on what they found, and I'll talk about that. What I will say just to start is, it doesn't completely change what we think about the Southern Army in 1780 and 81, but it gives us a lot more information. We can tell that it is a mix of the older guys who've been there since 76 and 77, and then everybody else were teenagers, essentially. If you haven't been to Camden, it's a really lovely spot. The battlefield had been in private hands until pretty recently. So it's completely undeveloped. It was owned by a paper company for a long time, so it's mostly just pine trees. And it's really nice, it's really calm. So it really belies what happens there. It's the exact opposite of where my research mostly focuses, which is the Battle of Long Island, the Battle of Brooklyn, which happens right in the middle of Brooklyn. It happens in Park Slope. So if you've never had a chance to go there, first I will recommend that you go up to Brooklyn next year for the 250th. But imagine being in the middle of downtown Brooklyn, when you're trying to... I'm sorry? No. Just imagine being in the middle of downtown Brooklyn and trying to envision it full of trees and people fighting. It's very different.
Is it true they just have a plaque there? There's nothing else there but a plaque on a wall?
No, that is not the case. So the house that you see right here is what we now call the Old Stone House, formerly the Veach Cordeloo House. And that one's not there anymore because it burned down in the 19th century, but it's a reconstruction of it is there. The Old Stone House is the historic site which reinterprets the Battle of Brooklyn. So we can talk more about what they have there and the things that they have on their plaque, which are less true than they could be, perhaps, regarding the location of the Maryland soldiers. And that actually gets us to an interesting spot. I'll talk more about this later on. One of the things that's discussed at Brooklyn is, where are the soldiers? So, quick introduction to the Battle of Brooklyn. The British land sort of on the shores of Brooklyn. They land on Staten Island, then they move across to Brooklyn in the summer of '76. And the Americans are there, they prepare, and they draw themselves up into a line of battle when the British begin to move. And everything is going fine on the side where the Marylanders are fighting. They're fighting nicely. But on the other side of the battlefield, the British have snuck around and have completely surrounded them. And so, as a result, everybody retreats. The battle is nearly a complete loss for the Americans, except that in the process of the retreat, about half of the soldiers from Maryland, who we now call the Maryland 400, find themselves blocking the advance of the British Army. They hold the British back from chasing the rest of the retreating Americans for a while, unless many of the Americans get off the battlefield. In the course of that, the Marylanders lose about a quarter of their strength, about 256 either killed or captured. So there's a lot of discussion about what happens to them after they die. There have been, for many years, there had been a story that there is one particular gravesite of the Marylanders, which is not true in any case. There's no truth to it all. There probably never was. And what it raises the question is, whenever somebody talks to me about that, what I say is, buried by whom? Who's going to bury them? Not the British. The British don't care. The Americans have left. And the same thing happens in Camden. We'll see what we've learned from Camden, where the ground has not been disturbed as much, gives us some interesting parallels that we can draw towards what happens at Brooklyn, or at Long Island, as we say. The Marylanders, so at Brooklyn, they take terrible casualties. About a year later, the Americans launch a bungled raid onto Staten Island, where they, instead of running into a small group of British soldiers, they run into a large army, and they literally leave the Marylanders behind to cover the retreat. And once again, they take terrible casualties. It happens for a third time at Camden. We'll talk more about exactly what happens. So the areas in Brooklyn, if you haven't been there, in Prospect Park, I hope you'll get up there and see it. There's a really lovely monument which is built there with funding from the SAR in around 1890. And so it says on one side, in honor of Maryland's for 100, and on the back side it has a quote from George Washington, "Good God, what brave fellows, I must this day lose," which is what Washington is supposed to have said while he was watching the battle. There's nothing like that at Camden. There is very little in Maryland to see from any of these battles, which is something that I kind of struggle with when I'm trying to talk to people about the Revolutionary War and about the role that the Marylanders played in it. The Maryland line plays an enormously important role in the course of the war, but they don't do it here. There is almost no fighting in Maryland at all. There are hardly even skirmishes. So we have to talk about other places. So you go up to Brooklyn, you can see this. You can go see the battle sites around Philadelphia and in the South. Where I work, down in Annapolis, we do have this. So the statue to Johann de Kalb, who was the German-born general who was leading the Marylanders at Camden. De Kalb was mortally wounded in the latter stages of the battles while he was rallying the troops. De Kalb was, even before the battle, even before he was killed, he was a revered figure. He was a very highly respected officer. And at his death, there were immediate moves made to commemorate him and to celebrate him. And in 1780, in August of 1780, so a few months after the battle, Congress passed a resolution giving Maryland the honor, essentially, to build a monument to de Kalb. Maryland authorizes the monument's construction in 1817, and then in the 1880s they build this next to the State House. In case you're wondering about government construction projects, they have not changed in the intervening 250 years. When I think about where we can remember the American Revolution, and particularly what the Maryland soldiers did, what the Maryland line did, I think about some things that we can see in Baltimore. The first time I gave this talk, I was in South Carolina, so I had to ask people where this was, what it was called. And of course the street that we see here. So Camden Yards, named after the train station, or the train yards that was there. But before that, named after Camden Street, named after the Battle of Camden. Utah Street, named after Utah Springs, which is another battle in North Carolina where the Marylanders also fought. Utah Springs was the last major battle that the Maryland line fought in the South. It was in September 1781. And after that, the British and Cornwallis need to go back up north to Virginia to recuperate, which is where they find themselves stuck at Yorktown. The Marylanders weren't really, there were very few Marylanders at the siege of Yorktown. Most of them were still in North Carolina, keeping an eye on the British. So this is where we can see this. Right now there are three, I think. I got it written down here. There are a couple of streets in Baltimore named after Revolutionary War battles. These were all named in the early 19th century when the streets were being laid out as Baltimore was being developed, and when the memories of these places were still well remembered. And so where are they? So one of them is Saratoga Street, right? That was an American victory. No Maryland soldiers there, but an American victory. And the rest of them, it's Camden, it's Utah Springs. These are terrible defeats. There is, I think, still a Cowpen Street, but it's not very long. There's not very much of it left.
Baltimore County.
Yeah, there's not really much of a Camden Street left anymore either. It's mostly under this now. And most of these are losses, but I think it reminds us that at the time these were being developed, at the early days of Baltimore City's construction, people still remembered what the Maryland troops had done, and this was something that was really important to them. I think it probably had more meaning to them than sometimes when we name things today after historic events. Because sometimes we'll name things after something that happened a long time ago, and it can feel a little abstract. This wasn't abstract. This was things that people there who were living there had been at. I think they remembered why it was so important. We'll talk a little bit about what happens at the battle. Not a lot. When we get to Camden, we'll talk a little bit about the battle, not a ton. If you want to learn sort of the nuts and the bolts and the who's marching which way, we can talk about that a little bit later. I get into this really, and the thing that I think tells the story a little bit better is talking about the people who were there. Sometimes when you're trying to imagine an 18th century battlefield, it's I think a little hard to put together, even if you do a lot of military history. But when we talk about the lives of the people who are there, I think that, to me at least, that resonates a little bit more. And a lot of what we have are what I think of as the small stories. They're not part of national narratives. These aren't individuals who changed the course of American history. But there are enough records left that you can get little glimpses of people's lives and get sort of a taste of what it was for the people who were there. Most of the research that this comes from, as Ross mentioned, comes from the book that I had been working on about the Maryland 400, so about the soldiers who enlisted in the summer of '76, or the beginning of '76. There are a few of those guys who are still there when we get down to it. Let's back up a moment. Horatio Gates. Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, as he is known, though he, of course, did not spearhead the American victory at Saratoga. That was Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan. In the spring of 1780, Washington sends a contingent of soldiers, mostly from Maryland and Delaware, into the Carolinas. The previous fall and that spring, the British had sent a new group of soldiers into the South. And first they go to Savannah, and then they go up to Charleston, working their way up the coast through the cities. And the reason they're doing that is because nothing's happened in the North. There's a battle in the summer of 1778 at Monmouth, and there's some other fighting between 78 and 79, but nothing really happens. The Americans capture a fort on the Hudson, and then they leave a week later, and the British recapture it, and the British leave a week later. And Washington takes his army out, marches it along the Hudson Highlands, and the British come out of New York, and they march around each other, and nobody does anything. And so the British decided it's time to change plans. They're going to go to the South. First of all, George Washington's army isn't there, which means that the South is going to be a little bit less defended. Also, the South had a reputation, somewhat deserved. The South had a reputation as being full of loyalists. And the British thought was, the New Englanders are trouble, and the trouble from the New Englanders kind of bleeds down into New York and Pennsylvania. But if they go into the South, the people in the South don't really want to rebel. And it's going to be friendly, and they'll be able to do something that the British were never able to do anywhere else. They'll be able to hold territory without an army. It doesn't work. As a spoiler, it doesn't work. But to counter this, Washington sends a contingent of soldiers. He doesn't send his main army. The main army stays there, and they spend the next year and a half marching in circles around the British in New York. But Washington sends about 1,500 or 2,000 soldiers from Maryland, mostly from Maryland, a regiment from Delaware, a contingent of artillery, and a very small and useless group of cavalry. And he sends them down, and they leave about April of 1780. They go by foot up into Elkton, or to Head of Elk, where they get on boats, and they move their way down the bay. They're being commanded by this gentleman, Horatio Gates. Gates is well accomplished. Unlike Washington, Gates has won battles that matter. Gates is deeply ambitious and thinks that he should be in charge of the army. He doesn't quite ever have the gall to directly challenge Washington, which is why Gates is not in charge of the army. So the Americans, they send the Marylanders, the new Southern Army, they send them from up here, where they're already there, in Morristown up here, and they go by foot to the Head of Elk, and then they go down the bay by boat. And supposedly they do this because it will keep the men from Maryland and Delaware from deserting while they're marching through their home territory. And there may be some truth to that. There are some folks who desert while they're in Elkton anyway. While they're in Elkton, they also get fed some fish. So there are not a lot of records of the preparations that the Americans make along the way. But one thing we do know is that when they get to Elkin, the only way they can come up with enough rations for 2,000 soldiers and a large but undefined number of women traveling with the army is that there's fish available, because you're right on the bay. And it is probably one of the few times that these guys get any food that is remotely fresh at all. So the only time they get anything at all that is nice. The rest of the trip, they go by boat until they get up the James River, where they get off. This is the historic Yellow Jacket, which has just come out specifically to bother us. It's great. And I've given a talk with a power one out, but I've never been stung by a bee during the talk. So they go by boat down the bay. It takes them about 2 weeks to get to Petersburg. As they travel, so I mentioned briefly that there are probably some women traveling with them. We don't know exactly who's there, but we can say this in general. If you think about the Continental Army as a group of men marching in their blue uniforms, then you're wrong. It's better to think of, and this is one of the historians who's, about this, describes it as a holistic family. That the men are there and they fight and they march, but the army doesn't do anything in terms of cooking or washing clothing. The army doesn't provide new uniforms. The army can't really even provide food. And so there's always a contingent of women traveling with the army, right from the very beginning. And they're doing all these things that the army doesn't do. Part of the reason that they're there is sort of simple economic necessity. It is, imagine there you are, it's the late 18th century, it's the 1770s, the 1780s. If you're a woman by yourself, because your husband's in the army, let's say you run a farm, even if you're sort of middle class, you can't run that farm by yourself. If you got money, you could hire help, but there's no money coming in because your husband isn't getting paid. Because theoretically, if he was getting paid, he could send some of his money back home, but there's no money. One of the American soldiers talks about how the only time he gets paid in hard currency instead of scrips, instead of IOUs, is when the French come in 1780 and they bring money with them to pay the soldiers. So no one's getting paid. And so the soldiers will bring their families with them, their wives and their children traveling with the army. It's not, to us it seems bizarre. It wasn't particularly unusual at the time. The British did it as well. The British had a better logistics system, so it wasn't quite as vital to them. There it was really more for morale. But when the British, so they're very organized, so they had systems to organize which women were going to come, who was going to get to bring their wife, that kind of thing. We know a few of the women who were there, just a few. Actually, a few of the women who wished to be there. We're going to come back to her in a second. So we have Hannah Aspinall and Christiana Innes. They were both married to privates in the Second Maryland Regiment. So part of the men who were there. They had hopes to be coming, but when they got to Elkton, they weren't allowed to board the ships to join. As they wrote, they were two women very big with child. They had been left on shore by order of our superior officers, with our time drawn very near. They had hoped that the government would provide them with some financial assistance to bring us through our soon expected state, which is natural to all of our sex. It's hard to imagine why an army wouldn't have wanted two very heavily pregnant women traveling with them on the next 1,000 miles of their trip. Backtrack for a second. The other thing is when we think about the Continental Army, we often think about them as all being white. And that also is something that we shouldn't do. The Maryland line, soldiers from Maryland, are at least 3.5% or 4% black at any given point in time. They are, except for 1776, when there were enough white soldiers to enlist, they are fighting in integrated units. The Revolutionary War, the Continental Army, there is almost entirely all the black soldiers are fighting in integrated units with side-by-side white soldiers. It will be the last time that America has an integrated army until 1948. Which also means that some of the people traveling with the army are not there voluntarily. It is hard to imagine some of the more aristocratic officers among the Maryland line traveling without enslaved servants with them. We know, we can only document one, Mordecai Gist, hero of Baltimore County. He has one of his enslaved servants runs away from him in camp. She runs away with her husband, who is a soldier. There's another reminder, the army is not all white. We don't know what happens to them. They seem to get away, though. By 1780, the soldiers from Maryland and Delaware, so these guys here in their lovely blue suits, they're experienced, they're battle-hardened. They have been in, some of them had been in 2 victories at Trenton and Princeton. Very few of the Marylanders were actually there. Most of them were sick and had gone home by then. So many of the guys from Maryland and Delaware hadn't actually ever been in much of a victory before. Still, they are extremely well disciplined. They are about, how many of these guys? About 150 of the guys who are going south at this point had been in the Army since early 1776. At least 10 of them who were in this group had been captured at the Battle of Brooklyn. They had been held, some of them had been held by the British as prisoners for just a few months and were released at the winter of 76-77. British conditions in British prisons was not very good. Some of you may know a little bit about that. So they kept them on
Prison ships?
some prison ships, some disused ships which they had anchored out in New York Harbor. There's hardly any food, there's no medicine, they're rife with disease. One historian estimates that among just the Americans captured at Brooklyn, so captured in August, that about 50% of them died that first winter of 76-77. Consequently, as a result, it leads to some things. Some of them, the Americans, end up in the British Army. Some of them we know are genuinely impressed. Some of them seem to have joined as a way to get off the prison ships. And at least one of them, Sergeant Peter McNaughton, is back in the Maryland line. He's in the British Army until 1779, when he escapes, makes his way back, and then almost immediately re-enlists to agree to serve for the rest of the war. About about 3/4 of the Marylanders re-enlisted at the end of 1776. Of those guys, a lot of them become officers, either commissioned officers or non-commissioned officers. Maryland starts with only 1 regiment, so about 1,000 soldiers, and at the beginning of 77, they need to raise 7 regiments. So anyone who'd been in the Army in 76 was automatically qualified for a leadership role because they had some experience. The only guys in Maryland with any military experience at that point. And we don't have any specific stories. Nobody says, and the guys from 76 taught me how to put my bayonet on, how to stand in a line. But the sergeants and corporals there serve about, on average, about 5 years in the Maryland line. So we know that's who's teaching the newcomers. That's who's teaching the new recruits how to be a soldier. And it's probably what makes the Marylanders so good over the course of the war. Many of those guys, as I mentioned, they get out in 79. The winter of 79, beginning of 1780, they've just endured their another terrible winter, worse than the Valley Forge winter, and most of them go home. But by then, they've really left their mark on it. So this is the final pay records of some of the First Maryland Regiment. William Smoot, Richard Smith, John Callahan, Demetri Buxton. So these guys had all been there since the beginning of 76.
How were they paid?
They're getting paid in IOUs. The conversation for another day is what happens to them after the war, where they get almost no money in return for it, thanks to star of musicals Alexander Hamilton. It's a conversation for a different day. And off they go. So not all of these men had been there for very long. Some of them had only recently enlisted. Joseph Smith, we know, who's a private in the 3rd Maryland Regiment. He'd been in the Army for 2 years, but in that time, he'd only been in 1 battle. He'd been in the attack on Stony Point. Others had only just joined the Army. We know, for example, there's Solomon Brittenham, who is in April of 1780, enlists as either a fifer or a private in the 2nd Maryland Regiment, just before his 15th birthday. He probably enlists in Annapolis as the Army's coming through Maryland. They send recruiters out. He probably enlists in Annapolis on the way. And he doesn't travel with the main group of soldiers, but he comes out and they join them later in the trip. One of his fellow musicians in the unit, Vachel Hayes, had been in the Army only a little bit longer, all the way since the previous summer, which made him a little bit more experienced, but not much more. Vachel Hayes has marched longer than Solomon had, but not much more than that. On the other hand, we do have some others. We have Hezekiah Ford and John Hardman. They are in the 2nd Maryland. They're both sergeants. They started as sergeants from the Eastern Shore. They both survived the Battle of Brooklyn. The company that they're in at Brooklyn lost 70% of its men, either killed or captured. And in the intervening years, Hardman has been made a captain, and Ford, just at the beginning of this campaign, Ford gets promoted to lieutenant. Thomas Wiseman, who's in the First Maryland Regiment, he'd enlisted back in January '76. He'd lost 2 fingers at the Battle of Brooklyn on his left hand, remained in the Army the whole time. He's still a private. Many of his comrades had recently secured promotions for themselves. Caleb Mason, who's just been made an ensign. Mason had started as a private in '76 and been very gradually, slowly ascending the ranks. In the spring of 1780, there is a number of these non-commissioned officers, of sergeants and corporals, who get made into commissioned officers. At the time, even whenever I say this, there's always some heads start nodding from the veterans. But even at the time, it was even harder for a sergeant to get promoted to become an officer, since there was an expectation that officers were all from the higher classes, from the better social standing. But in 1780, they lose a lot of soldiers, they lose some officers, and there's an opportunity, essentially, for men to get promotions to become officers based on merit. It's not happened a lot during the war, so I think it speaks very well of these people. One of them is Caleb Mason, who'd been a sergeant and becomes an ensign. Ensign is the lowest rank, the lowest commissioned rank. And then we also have other guys who take a more conventional route to becoming officers. John Gasaway and Gasaway Watkins. John Gasaway is from Anne Arundel County. Gasaway Watkins is now from what's now Howard County. They both start out as sergeants. They're both very distantly related to each other. But as young men of the gentry, they do gradually become officers. John Gasaway doesn't want to leave anything to chance, and so you can see this is the letter he writes where he pleads. I'm sure you can use a great deal of influence with the Council of Safety, hoping that he'll get himself a commission. This is from May '76. It takes him another couple months to get there. Many of these soldiers some of these soldiers, I should say, had less distinguished careers. Edward Cosgrove is a private in the First Maryland Regiment. He had been, a couple years earlier, he'd been arrested for theft and for desertion, for which he received 300 lashes, which is an enormous number. Wow. Hard to really imagine. He's in the same regiment as Christian Close, who'd also enlisted in 1776. Re-enlisted at the end of the year. And at the same time that he re-enlisted, he also enlisted in a Pennsylvania unit in order to pick up an extra enlistment bounty. He may also have been getting kickbacks from the captain of that Pennsylvania unit, who was probably enlisting Marylanders as a way to meet his quota. These guys were all still there. List of deserters. Benjamin Worthington. This is a list of deserters who's written up in early 1779 by one of the officers in the 2nd Maryland Regiment. Comes with a long list of soldiers who are missing, and it comes with a note a letter where he complains, what's the point of having laws about capturing deserters if no one does anything to capture them? The problem is that there's nothing they can really do about bringing them back. And the other problem is that sometimes guys are leaving because they don't want to be in the Army anymore, because they're not getting paid and they're not getting fed. And they're tired of it and they're losing the war and they just want to go home. But sometimes they just want to go home for a little while. Benjamin Worthington. Benjamin Worthington, in late 1778, deserts from the Guard with some other troops and goes back home to Talbot County. But he comes back in March, apparently resuming his duties without any punishment. He does the same thing again. He does, in fact, in December 1779, he leaves and comes back home again in 1780, in March again. What's the pattern that we're seeing here? Why are they coming back in March?
Spring.
It's spring, right? He doesn't want to spend winter in camp with the Army anymore. And so a lot of the people who they're calling deserters are really, I think, probably better to say that they're absent without leave. People can get furlough sometimes, but mostly, if you wanted to take a break, you would just go home. And you could, because it wasn't that far away. It's a week's journey back home. Worthington re-enlists between his two desertions. He re-enlists to agree to serve for the rest of the war. So we talked a little bit about black soldiers with the Army. We don't know the names of most of the black soldiers. It's probably the only time in Maryland during the Revolutionary period, or even later, where their race wasn't mentioned. A handful of them, their race is mentioned in either the enlistment records or in other records, but mostly they're just listed on the recruitment list, on the muster rolls with the white soldiers, which I guess is a nice moment of equality, but it is not helpful for us when we're trying to figure out who they were. So we can identify about 70 black soldiers from Maryland who served. That's over the course of the whole war. In 1778. 1778 is the only time that the Army does a count of how many black soldiers there are. They do it once. There were almost 100 from Maryland at the time. And so of the people we know who were in the Army, we know at least 7 of them who were still there in 1780, who were fighting in the Southern Campaign. So Francis Freeman, Nace Butler, Jacob Blake, Adam Adams, David Wilson, Henry Williams, and Thomas Kearney. And Kearney goes on to become somewhat famous. Kearney is promoted to corporal at some point during the war. Probably the only African American who was promoted during the war. And although it doesn't give him a lot of power, it is very rare that anyone who is black is in a position of authority over people who are white in Maryland during the 18th century, 19th century. We're going to talk a little bit about uniforms just while we're here going past. We expect to see that they're going to be wearing these lovely blue coats with their red facings, their red lapels. And there are certainly some who have that. It is also probably true that some of them have brown coats, maybe with red facings, maybe just brown. We know that at some point in the Southern Campaign that there are guys with red coats and blue facings because they buy an equal amount of red cloth and blue cloth. So some guys end up with red coats and some guys with blue coats. And some of them probably have no uniforms at all. Because the Americans have a terrible time getting supplies to people. And your lovely coat, wool as it is, may not last very long. And there's nowhere to get a new one along the way. So off we go. Here we go, marching our way down. They go. So they go by boat, they get to Petersburg at the end of May. And they start marching through Virginia. And they get to North Carolina in early June. And they wait for a few weeks there. They're recuperating, probably gathering supplies, and they're waiting for additional troops to come. So people like Solomon Brittingham, who enlisted in April. They get to Hillsborough, North Carolina, so it's near the border, in about 3 weeks later. And they take rest for another week. It is a hard journey. It's a long walk, for one thing. But they're doing it with not enough wagons to carry the baggage. They're doing it, which means that people have to carry more gear than they normally would. They're doing it without a lot of food, because the Americans don't make any preparations along the way. You know, we talk about it. There's fish for them when they get to Head of Elk. But that's really about it. And I guess the goal had been that they were going to collect food as they went. And for comparison, when the French marched down on their way to Yorktown a year later, the French, ahead of the army, they send people to buy up supplies of wheat. They sign contracts with bakers for bread for in the future. They buy ovens so that they can make their food as they go along. And the Americans don't do that. It's 1780, and they still haven't learned how to manage an army. And they just send them down to the south with the hope that they'll find some food there. It's also, let's say by this point, late June in North Carolina or Virginia. That's not a nice time of year to be marching in your wool coat through the summer heat. And so they're moving slowly. And as they get into North Carolina, in June into early July, the supply situation just continues to deteriorate. And so we hear one of our soldiers from Delaware. So I always say at this point, I don't talk a lot about the soldiers from Delaware because I don't research them as much. But unlike the people from Maryland, the Delaware soldiers leave some first-hand accounts of what's going on. So with the Delaware guys, we do have some presence. So Sergeant William Seymour, he writes, "At this time we were very much distressed for want of provisions, and were obliged to send out parties for grain for our sustenance. This availed not much, for what was produced could scarce keep the troops from starving, and occasioned a vast number of men to desert." About this time, Gates finally joins the army at the end of July. He goes on a hard ride from his home in Virginia. It took a while for them to appoint him, and it took a while for the news to get from Philadelphia out to where he lived. And there had been some who were hoping that the arrival of the hero of Saratoga would help improve their conditions. And unfortunately, that's not what happened. And things get worse instead. If they had been hoping to find any support from the local population, they were disappointed. The British had hoped that there were more loyalists in the South, and they were true, at least to an extent. Seymour complains that they were surrounded on all sides by our enemies, the Tories. It probably didn't help that the Americans are sending out foraging parties to raid the farms and whatever food that they can find there. As the Americans get to the North Carolina-South Carolina border in late July, Seymour talks about how they were so much distressed for want of provisions that we were 14 days and drew but 1/2 pound of beef per man. And that so miserably poor scarce any mortal could make use of it. They're marching 20 miles a day at this point. They're living on chiefly green apples and peaches, which rendered our situation truly miserable, being in a sick and weakly condition. It's July. Most of the crops aren't ready to eat yet. So even if there was a lot of food to gather, it's not ready yet. Even the officers, and we usually think of the officers as being better supplied and better provisioned. The officers, we know that there's a story about them making soup that they are thickening with their hair powders, what they put on their hair to make it look nice and gray. And hair powder is a mix of herbs, a little ground up bone. So it actually will help thicken your soup a little bit. But that's the level of desperation that we're talking about. And it's at this point that the Americans learned that the British were there. So Camden is right in the middle of South Carolina. It's sort of neither backcountry nor low country, sort of almost as dead center as you can get. And it's got some, it is strategic in that way because it's one of the few towns in the middle part of the state. South Carolina didn't have cities the same way some places did. Yes, sir.
They were going through North Carolina. North Carolina didn't supply anything to help, or
Not really, not systematically.
No soldiers.
They're way out in the backcountry, right? So if they've been marching on the coast where there's some cities, they might have been able to get something from the South Carolina government, but not out where they are. There's no government. Effectively, there's no government out there.
North Carolina is just
it's full of loyalists. It probably wouldn't have mattered. We know that even when the American army is in places that's friendly territory, when they're in Pennsylvania or Connecticut or New York, the civilian population isn't particularly excited to see the army then either.
Okay.
Soldiers were viewed with a great deal of suspicion, not least because they're there to steal all of your stuff. Soldiers are hungry, and they're going to find the food that's there for them. Joseph Paul Martin, who writes, as a soldier from Connecticut, he writes a memoir of the war. And he says that essentially, we felt bad for what we were doing, but what are you going to do?
Right.
And that's the situation that these guys are in. So they're approaching Camden. They know that Cornwallis and the British are out there somewhere. They're close by, and they know that the British are there. The British know that the Americans are close by as well, and so they begin to start maneuvering around to try to get into a good spot. In the last week, in the week before the battle, the Americans marched nearly 70 miles. The last 6 of them as a night march, and also a particularly miserable march. The soldiers had been issued, instead of a ration of rum to help rejuvenate their spirits, they were given molasses, which did not rejuvenate their spirits. Instead, it had very much the opposite effect. Seymour describes, instead of enlivening us, it served to purge us, and the men all along the way were every moment obliged to fall out of the ranks.
Oh my God.
Now, I should say, you're right, as they go through North Carolina and Virginia, they do pick up a contingent of militia soldiers. So they do have about 1,000 new militia soldiers who have joined the army. And As a result, the Americans now have more soldiers than the British do. And so they begin to get themselves positioned for where they want to be to fight. And instead of what happens is getting into a strategic spot, is they more or less walk into the British at night. The British and the Americans have both camped down for the night. The Americans are there, they're in their gear, they're, as they say, sleeping on their arms. And they notice that each other are not very far away. And so what happens, so we have the main road that goes through, it's still there, there's still only one road through there. The British are on this side, and the Americans are here. They find themselves in the middle of the night, there's a brief skirmish at night, and then when the sun rises, the attack resumes in earnest. The Marylanders are over here, the North Carolina and Virginia militia are here, and the rest of the Marylanders are these guys back here in reserve. And the British begin the attack. Delaware Lieutenant Thomas Anderson, he writes, "We lay on our arms until daylight on August 16th, at which time the enemy advanced and charged. Our left wing, where the militia was formed, gave way, which gave our enemy an opportunity to surround us. The action soon became desperate and bloody for some time, but we were at last obliged to give way with the loss of all our artillery and baggage." Sergeant Seymour complains, "The militia were in great confusion, having retreated off, the great part of them without so much as firing a single shot." So it's all right. All right, we'll talk a little bit about what happens here. So the militias here, they're on the front line. These are people who've probably never been in combat before. There's probably guys who've never fired their weapons at a person before. And when they see the British coming, and as it happens, the British soldiers who are on this side are the best British soldiers. And so these guys, they run immediately. They turn, and they have a hard time getting through the Marylanders who are in reserve. And there's some confusion and there's some trouble, but eventually the Marylanders do manage to get through them. Again, we're talking a very disciplined group of soldiers. And they manage to get back up and they manage to join the battle. But by then it's mostly too late. Over here on this side, this is where DeKalb is. And that is, the battle's going much better there. That the Marylanders hold off the charge by the British, and they are actually able to drive the British back, and they do very briefly break through the British lines, but not for very long. And eventually, the British wipe them off the field. There becomes a very sort of chaotic retreat. One of the people who retreats rather chaotically is, in fact, General Gates. So Gates is in the back where the general normally would be. And as the militia begins to flee off the field in panic, Gates describes that he is swept off the field with them. And he is swept off the field with them so quickly that he is forced to ride all the way back to North Carolina, almost without stopping. And they go into this battle, so Gates is gone. They go into this battle without any provision for what happens if there's a retreat. Typically, an army would have set some sort of a rally point up at the back to try to organize themselves again. Nothing like that happens at all. So here's DeKalb. DeKalb is, here's the death of DeKalb. DeKalb is bayoneted, I think it's 12 times or 17 times. He dies a week later in British captivity. And the Marylanders, they fight well. They fight as well as they could. The Maryland and Delaware troops eventually are all swept off the field. Hezekiah Ford, who we met earlier on, Ford finds himself in the latter parts of the battle in some hand-to-hand combat, in a perilous position. He is attacked, the story goes, by a hand-to-hand by a stout, athletic Englishman, while the British were advancing. In the scuffle, Ford threw the British soldier, the enemy holding Ford by the hair. Ford having nothing but his long espontoon, he pinned the British soldier to the sand. So that's what he's holding over here, his spontoon or his espontoon, which looks like a pike or a spear. They weren't really for fighting. They were used by officers as a way to show that their status as officers, and as a way to show their position in battle, right? You could lift it up higher, and the people could see where you were. Almost never used as a weapon. This is one of the few cases. As the Englishman released his grip from Ford's hair, Ford extricated himself. He was pinning the soldier to the sand with his spontoon, but finding his weapon still held fast, Ford fled without it. The only story I found of a Marylander using his S-pontoon for anything other than holding. The retreat is chaotic, as I said. Gasaway Watkins describes his close escape. Pursued by the cavalry, he jumped a fence 11 logs high, was 2 days and nights in the woods without seeing anybody. He talks about how he escapes, he ends up in a tavern where he tries to find a shelter, and the innkeeper says, "You don't want to stay here, this is full of British sympathizers." And so he gets him some clothes, he helps him get across the river and away. The Marylanders lose, so of the, say about 1,500 Maryland soldiers, they lose 600, killed, captured, or missing at the battle. Records that document the fate of the Americans at Camden, they're very sparse, they're incomplete, in part because the records are lost at the battle. One of them briefly mentions that they have to flee without their baggage. And the baggage is part of what's in there are the regimental records, are the records from the army. So we don't even really know exactly how many of them are there. Along the march, they would have been keeping track of it. They would have had enlistment records and strength returns and things like that. That's all gone. So we don't even know all the soldiers who are there, and it's hard to figure out exactly what happens to all of them as a result. We know a handful are killed. We know Caleb Mason is killed, our newly made ensign. John Hardman is killed as well. John Gasaway is captured. Captain and future Governor Levin Winder is captured. Joseph Smith, who we met earlier, he's wounded in the side by a bayonet. And so is John Innes, whose pregnant wife Christiana had been left behind in Maryland. Many of the missing eventually turn up again. There are little groups of soldiers wandering through the Carolina countryside for weeks. And they eventually start to rally up in Charlotte, North Carolina. Some of them, if you look at them, they're initially listed as missing or as deserters. Benjamin Worthington is called a deserter again, but he shows up. He spends the rest of the war with the army. Christian Close also is enlisted as mission. He also seems to turn up again. One of the men who doesn't never make it. Yes, sir.
When they did take prisoners, because they're not in New York, no prison ships, where did they take the prisoners? Do you know?
They keep some of them in the town of Camden for a while, and they send some of them on to Charleston. And actually, some of them, when they're being marched to Charleston, they get rescued by a group of American cavalry. Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, rescues them. Some of whom elect not to rejoin the American army and to stay as prisoners of war. This time being held by the Americans. We don't know quite what happens to all of them. Most of them seem not to get released until the very end of the war. One of the people who remained there, who's listed as a deserter, is Thomas Wiseman. After the battle, Wiseman later writes, he was taken sick and did not again join the army. Presumably by the time he had recovered, it was long gone. He had no way of finding it again. So he lives the rest of his life in Edgefield County in South Carolina, about 100 miles away from Camden. There was a lot of argument then, there's still argument now, over why the battle goes so badly for the Americans and whether it's all Gates' fault. Wiseman certainly does. He calls it Gates' defeat. And a lot of them, the veterans from Maryland call it that. The battle where Gates was defeated, things like that. You know, it's hard to say. By the time the two armies run into each other, there's not much that Gates could have done to prevent the battle from happening. They weren't really prepared for it to happen when it did, but neither were the British. The thing that probably would have helped is if they hadn't put the militia on the front line. If they'd put both sides of the battlefield had been veteran, experienced soldiers with the militia in the back as reserve, the battle would have played out very differently. We'll never know. Gates goes directly to Hillsborough, North Carolina, so quickly that people make jokes about it. He immediately begins writing letters to Congress explaining why none of this is his fault. The soldiers begin to gather up in Charlotte, and the highest ranking officer anywhere is William Smallwood. Smallwood is from Maryland. He's a major general, the highest ranking Marylander in the war. Smallwood had been a commander since the beginning. He is the man who leads the soldiers in New York in 1776, the beginning of the war. So Smallwood takes command of the army as it rebuilds, and he is thrilled to do so. Smallwood thought that he should have been in charge of the Southern Army right from the beginning. And now he sees an opportunity to unseat Gates. And so Smallwood immediately begins writing letters back to Congress, explaining why this is Gates' fault and why Smallwood should be in charge. And neither of them get command. So when the army reformed, they put together a new Southern Army. They put Nathaniel Greene in charge. Smallwood lobbies for it so aggressively that some of the members in Congress talk about how they're a little bit embarrassed for him, that he was sort of embarrassing himself in the process. Smallwood never really holds a command of much importance in the rest of the war. Greene is appointed in October, makes it to North Carolina about a month later. The Americans have indeed been dealt a severe blow, but they're not destroyed. The army is still there. The surviving Maryland and Delaware soldiers that had made up 8 regiments before, they get consolidated back down to 1 regiment. But they're still there. They send a number of Maryland officers get sent back home to recruit new soldiers. And it takes them about a year to raise enough soldiers, but eventually they do, and they make it back down. Some of them are there at Yorktown. And they're still there. The Marylanders remain there with the army through the campaign. So we'll sprint our way through the rest of the Southern campaign. So they fight at Cowpens in January '81, which is an American victory. At Hobkirk's Hill, which is just outside the town of Camden, which is another defeat. 96, which is a defeat. Utah Springs, which is a defeat. Guilford Courthouse, which the Americans call a victory. I guess we can call it a victory, sort of. And the British never managed to actually beat them. And that's the problem, is that the Americans, the Marylanders, keep losing the battles. But they inflict enough damage on the British, and they are never truly defeated. And it drives the British crazy.
Well, it ties the British Army up too, doesn't it, from moving to more important...
Well, so the British would have had hopes of spending time in the South, liberating the countryside, and instead what they do is they have to go to Yorktown. It isn't on this map. They have to go to Yorktown to resupply, because they've lost so many men, especially at Utah Springs. And they get stuck at Yorktown when the French Navy shows up and the French Army shows up. While that's happening at Yorktown, most of the Marylanders are still there. They stay in the Carolinas, and they actually spend 1782 and most of '83 in the Carolinas. The British don't leave Charleston until most of the way through 1783. Some of the men who survived Camden are killed in those battles. Fifer Vachel Hayes, Captain Edward Edgerly, who'd been in the Army since '76. They're killed at Utah Springs. Archibald Anderson is killed at Guilford. Captain William Betty is killed at Hobkirk's Hill. It seems as though Betty's death at Hobkirk's Hill causes the American lines to collapse, and leads to the American defeat there. For Thomas Aspinall, Camden proves to be his final battle. He was discharged at the end of the year, presumably heading home to be with his wife and their newly born child. Solomon Brittingham serves until 1783. He eventually moves to Ohio. John Hardman, John Gasaway and Gasaway Watkins move on to become parts of Maryland's gentry. John Gasaway is the adjutant general commanding the militia during the War of 1812. Hezekiah Ford becomes a political leader in Central County. Edward Cosgrove is convicted again of desertion in October 1781 while they're in Virginia. He's sentenced to death, he's pardoned, and goes back to South Carolina with the rest of them. William Seymour, whose diary we heard from along the march, finally goes back home to Delaware in January 1783. Captain John Hardman is killed at the battle, and someone remembers him, and in the early 20th century, a gun emplacement at a fort in Maine is named after him. He's got no particular connection to Maine. So this is at Fort Baldwin, which is sort of a little bit outside of Portland if you're driving your way up the coast of Maine. The fort, they build it by the 20s, the Army gets rid of it. What you see here, they rebuilt part of it in the 1940s, just in case they needed to defend the coast during World War II, I guess. Joseph Smith is captured, he's wounded, he's held prisoner first in Charleston, later he's sent to St. Augustine in Florida, and then finally Halifax, Nova Scotia, where the British have a large military presence. And then in a prisoner exchange, he's released in the summer of '81, and is back in Annapolis. Smith settles in Baltimore eventually after the war, becomes a successful businessman, until his son-in-law's debts eventually drive him into bankruptcy. When he applies for federal veterans pension in 1818, he applied under his real name, Elias Pollock. He, in fact, produces a witness to swear that Pollock had, quote, enlisted and passed under the name of Joseph Smith. Pollock's pension application also reveals something else unusual. He signed his name, it's a little hard to see, but he signs his name in Hebrew and insisted on swearing, quote, on the 5 books of Moses, he being a Jew. Pollock is the only known Jewish soldier in the Maryland line, in the Continental Army. There may have been others, but probably not very many at all, just given the small, how few Jews there are in Maryland during the Revolutionary War. It is very unusual that he signs his name in Hebrew. It's the only way we know that he's a Jewish soldier. I have a whole talk about him that I can give for another day. Pollock's pension, we've heard a little bit about their pension applications. Your Solomon Brittingham's pension applications. Their military service provides them with, becomes really an essential lifeline. And their pension applications, they're writing these in 1818, 1820s, 1830s, 3-4 decades after the battles that they're talking about. And they're full of first-hand descriptions of what happens. And there are details in them that we would never get anywhere else. Pollock talks about that he gets wounded by a bayonet, and that he gets taken prisoner. And that's not something that shows up in any of the other military records, either because they were lost, or because the Army didn't care enough about ordinary soldiers to write down what had happened to them. This is the only time for a lot of them that their stories ever get set down on paper. They're often very brief, but they are, for a lot of them, the only way we know what happens to them. And I think it gives us an opportunity to bear witness to their lives and their experiences. And for most of them, there really is no way to know what happens to them. We don't know what their experiences are. And for most of them at Camden and most of the battles during the Revolution, there are no graves even for them. And so that brings us to the second half here. So in Camden, at the historic site, in the fall of 2022, they began to exhume some of the graves that were there. Typically, at a battle site, you don't do that. That the bodies are left where they were. For one thing, you don't want to disturb them. You don't want any artifacts or evidence that are there. You don't want people going looking for it. But also sort of the bigger picture of, at the very least, you're dead and you've been buried here, you at least should get to stay there where you are. And if they do get exhumed, traditionally they would get reburied at the site where they were initially buried. What happened in Camden is these were in places that were either high traffic areas, or some of them, I think probably all of them in reality, were in spots that were fairly well known in the relic hunter community. The Camden battlefield, because it was privately owned and had no protection, was very heavily visited by relic hunters, guys with metal detectors digging up bullets and buttons and things like that. And some of the fear was that these were the people who they disinterred were in places that people knew where they were, or that they were in spots where the graves were in danger of eroding away. So when I was there, they held is a really wonderful event. They had a ceremony to, say reinter them. They actually ended up not reinterring them back on the battlefield. They reinterred them nearby. They had a fight with the Army. That's a conversation for another day. And we learned a lot about who's there. So as I said, there are 14 soldiers. One of them is from a North Carolina Loyalist unit. He was Native American. And as a result, he was not included with the reinterments. He is being handled with cooperation through some of the tribes that are in North Carolina. One of the graves that they found was a British soldier. He was, what's the age here? He was, it's written right there. So you think something between 25 and 40. He is from one of the Highland units of the 71st Regiment Foot. He's the only one who they found who had a proper burial. He's about 30 inches deep in today, so probably deeper at the time, was factoring for some erosion. He was, when I was there, the anthropologists talked about how he would have been a big, stocky guy. And that probably makes some sense. He was probably a sergeant, and he was also probably in a unit of guys who they wanted to be big, strong, burly guys, who they would put out in front and have them run at the opposing soldiers. Yes, ma'am?
Was he from Scotland originally?
Yes. So the Highland soldiers were all recruited from way up north in Scotland. Here's a picture of them, of the Highland soldiers in their dress. There are, what's the number? Let me get this, make sure I get this number right. There are 12 soldiers, but most of the Americans are in only a handful of graves. So grave 11 is 14 inches deep. There are one of the soldiers is between 25 and 45, and the other is somewhere over 20. This is what they can tell from the analysis of the bones. Grave 12 is 11 inches deep. Grave 13 isn't a whole lot deeper. They're really shallow. Some of that is erosion, sure. The ground just being compacted from heavy machinery driving on top of it. But a lot of the times the graves are really shallow because who's burying them, right? Not the British. The British don't care. It's likely that the burials were done by captured Americans, probably by enslaved workers from nearby farms who are impressed into doing it. And they're burying them with their hands, with bayonets. Near one of the graves, they found a broken 18th century tin cup, and the supposition is that that's the cup that was used to dig the grave out with. There you are burying your comrades, and you don't have anything to dig a grave with. And soil is sandy in South Carolina, but still. One of the other things they did, so this is grave 9, while they're digging it out. One of the things they did is they took DNA samples from all the remains, with the hope that they'd get some viable information, that they'd be able to try to trace who these people are. They're all completely unidentified. There's no way of knowing who they are. We can only tell that they're Americans mostly because of the buttons that they have with them. Nothing else survives, really. They were able to get DNA samples from a few of them that actually had enough in them that they could work with them. And so there's been a team working to do forensic genealogy, tracing the DNA, moving forwards and backwards through time, trying to identify some of them. One of them is in grave 9B, as we call him. So he is grave 9 is 5 individuals, 14 inches deep. There you can see on this side, this is from one of them, it's an arm bone, it's a humerus with a musket ball that was found up against it, but did not break it. So it was probably, had been fired from a long way and didn't have a lot of energy left. And so this was not a fatal wound. From a few of them, you can actually identify how they were killed from the musket balls that were found sort of mixed in with them. What really strikes me is how young they are. There's 2 of them who are probably in their 20s, maybe they're their 30s. One of them who's significantly older. That's a guy who'd probably been in the army since '76. He's probably one of my soldiers. And the rest of them, they're essentially their children. That's who's left, and who's still willing to join the army in 1780. This is one of the buttons that they found in grave 9B in this one as well. So they all were, this is that sort of the USA button, which is what most of the Maryland soldiers would have been carrying, or would have been wearing. So like I said, they've been working really hard. They've been collecting DNA samples from people in Maryland, people with Maryland heritage, trying to put together a genetic profile of who it is. 9B is the one that they're closest with. They've identified, I think if I got this right, they've identified his grandparents. The next step is much harder to figure out exactly who he is, but they can identify living descendants. So they are, if you want more information, please, you can go to their website, scan their QR code, find out more about it. What's really hard, and anybody here who's done genealogy, I'm sure some of you have done some family history, is finding people at all can be really hard. But we're looking for young people. And so we're looking for people who haven't left much of a paper trail behind. In the 1770s, the 1780s, your name doesn't show up on many government documents, no matter who you are, even if you're rich. And so, if you think about a common soldier who's 16, 17, 18, 19, probably isn't married. There's no marriage records. A handful of the people, I should say, who were killed at Camden, eventually somebody files probate for them later on after they die, but most of them don't. Most of them wouldn't have had enough property to make it worthwhile going through. It's hard to identify people. It's hard to identify women's families because they will show up with only their married name. If you can't find a marriage record telling you which Elizabeth Jones this is and who she married, which person named Jones she married, it's really hard to figure out. It's hard to get much further, but they are still working on it, and it is on one hand, it's a really neat thing that they're doing, and I think it could lead to some really fitting ways to pay tribute to these people. But I think more than that, this is the first time this has ever been done. This is the first time there's been any kind of effort with hope of identifying unidentified Revolutionary War soldiers who were killed in combat. So this is really sort of unprecedented, groundbreaking work that they're doing. So that's all there is for me. As I mentioned earlier, if you're talking in just a second, as I mentioned earlier, this is based on research that I had done through working on the Maryland 400. The book is in the process of coming out. The manuscript is due in the middle of December, so it's going to be a little bit of a white-knuckle ride to get there. But it will be out in time for the 250th anniversary. If you're interested in learning more about the project, or if you're interested in finding out how you can support it, please go to the website. I also have brochures up here. The publication of the book is being done entirely through private funds. There's no state funds going into this. The state does not have money for that kind of thing. So thank you all so much for being here today and for listening. I am happy to answer some questions if you've got any. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the pensions. Were they successful, and how much did they get? And I got one more question after that.
So most of these guys do get their pension. Even Elias Pollock, who enlists under a fake name.
Right.
And all he produces is one of his buddies who says, "Oh yeah, he fought as Joseph Smith. That's enough. He gets his pension." Let's see. He gets Solomon Brittenham, or his widow. He was a private. He gets $80 a year. This is under the 1853 law. It's based on what your rank was. The other one. So here we go. Elias Pollock. He's getting in 1819. He gets $8 a month, so it's a little bit less.
When the Americans took prisoners, I don't know if you might get what did they do with them? Do you know? I just thought of that.
Sure. When the Americans take prisoners, they keep them mostly in Pennsylvania or in Virginia, out in the mountains.
They had a camp, or
they have a series of camps. So they really So the Americans only take prisoners big groups of prisoners a couple of times. And the guys they capture at Saratoga, they actually spend most of the war marching them up and down the country because they don't want to leave them in one place, so the British can't get them back. They capture a lot of Hessian soldiers at Trenton and at Princeton. And they keep the Hessians they send out into the mountains of Virginia near Winchester, where a lot of the Hessians look around and say, "Gee, this looks a lot like home." And they stay there. It was also full of Germans already, which helped. But there are a series of camps and sort of stockades that the Americans build in York and Lancaster.
Oh, okay.
They keep some in Fort Frederick for a while. Maryland's government complains they have no money to supply soldiers, they have no money to supply prisoners, and Congress says, "Sure, you're going to keep some prisoners at Fort Frederick anyway." So they kind of put them where they can find spots for them. They treat them much nicer than the British do.
yeah,
It's fair to say.
yeah, I've read about the British. Yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful. If anyone else has any other questions, you don't want to shout it out in front of everyone, I'll be here for a little while if you have anything else. But once again, thank you all so much for coming out today. Thank you, Owen, so much. I hope you're off.